This is the morning of the 11th. A clip put up by Mind to clarify. Trump's tariff grift officially dead as SCOTUS rules against him. Let's have a listen to this clip. Plays for 21 minutes.
Friends, thanks for being here today. What if I told you that a single 45-year-old law might hold the power to completely upend our economy, that a forgotten statute could be used to give one person the power to tax the entire world? It sounded like there was more agreement than disagreement among the justices, and it's for the very simple reason that the principle of no taxation without representation is at the very foundation of our republic. The only thing that makes this case at all interesting and potentially difficult is that the administration is claiming not that the power to impose tariffs belongs to the president rather than to Congress. They are claiming simply that the 1977 International Economic Emergency Powers Act gave the power to tax to the president in limited circumstances. Now, the language of the law says that the power that is given to the president is the power to regulate import.
Ad just popped up. They just pop these ads on us, don't they?
Or exportation. And the question arises, and several of the justices seemed slightly puzzled by it. If, as everyone agrees, that Congress could regulate imports out of existence, it could say no imports from any of the following countries. No imports from anywhere. Fortress America. If Congress could give that power to the president, the power to ban importation, isn't the power to tax importation a lesser included power? Even some of the liberals seem to wonder about that. But the answer which emerged, though not as clearly as it might have, is that the power to tax is not a lesser power. It is simply a different power. And way back in 2012, when the court had before it the Affordable Care Act, it was predicted that Chief Justice Roberts would make a dramatic distinction between the power to regulate and the power to tax. A lot of people said that was ridiculous. The argument was that there might not be 5 justices on the Supreme Court to uphold the purchase mandate as an exercise of Congress's regulatory power. But it was thought that Chief Justice Roberts might provide a 5th vote to uphold that mandate as an exercise of the power to tax. And sure enough, that's what he did. And that was why 5 justices upheld Obamacare. Now, in this case, again, reflecting some very basic principles of law, the Chief Justice made the leading argument that the core power to tax is not simply an ancillary power of the power to regulate. The power to tax is a distinct power. Sure, the statute does allow the president to use licensing as a form of regulation, and there can be license fees to cover the costs of processing and import. But something that has the purpose and effect of raising revenue by taking money out of the pockets of American consumers. And the president has made no bones about it. He says this is a revenue raiser. He says it raises $1 trillion. Well, those numbers are off by maybe a factor of 1,000, maybe it's some billions of dollars. But you can't deny that this is not simply an incidental feature. This is a massive transfer of money from the pockets of American taxpayers to the United States Treasury. He can't have it both ways. If it is basically a revenue-raising measure, and if it is a measure that imposes, as everyone seems to agree finally that it does, imposes a major tax on American consumers, then all of the principles about taxing power kick in. And unless Congress clearly says that in this statute, for the first time in American history, the power to regulate is used as a catch-all to cover everything, including taxation. Unless we have clear evidence of that, then this case is another example of what is called the major questions doctrine. You don't have a question any more major than this. And the principle, and it was applied to strike down President Biden's loan forgiveness program and his COVID mandates. The basic principle is that if Congress gives broad power to the president, power that does not clearly and explicitly include the major power in question, then it is not up to the courts to fill in that power. And once the courts And here justices across the spectrum were concerned. The courts give a new power to the president where Congress has not clearly enacted it. You think the president in the future is ever going to give it back? Congress can't claw it back against a president who will veto the clawback. And so various justices expressed the concern, a very broad structural concern, that if it were to uphold this use of this broad statute that does not explicitly confer the power to tax, if it were to use that to give this president that power, then future presidents would have it. And for example, as Justice Gorsuch made clear, a future president who believes that climate change is not a hoax might be able to use this power basically to eliminate the imports of cars or to tax them so heavily that they can't come into the country for all practical purposes. So this became a decision that could have been complicated, but was rendered quite simple by the difficulty that the Solicitor General had getting away from the basic facts. And it is kind of a lesson in how not to argue a Supreme Court case to listen to someone talk at 1,000,000 miles a minute, as though by talking over the justices faster than anybody he could avoid common sense and basic principle. One of the things that's striking is that there wasn't really any quoting of the president himself in the argument. All the things he has said about how we're going to balance the budget with tariff money, he has said so many things about it being specifically to raise revenue. But one thing that Justice Sotomayor did use was when she said the president threatened to impose a 10% tax on Canada for an ad it ran on Tariff's World Series. So Justice Sotomayor did take note of that particular public moment. Right? And also she took note of the fact that he plans to, or actually has imposed massive tariffs on Brazil to punish Brazil because its highest court dared to hold its wannabe dictator accountable. So the real world in which the president basically puts his foot in it quite often was not absent from this argument. There's also a part where Switzerland was discussed, which is important because the Solicitor General made the argument that this is all about the horrible predatory trade practices of other countries that have created an imbalance of payments. But we actually sell more to Switzerland than we buy from Switzerland. It was pointed out that there's a 39% tariff on Switzerland, one of these random tariffs. That's true. But the Solicitor General did come back and say that that was an example of using tariffs for leverage, because imposing a tax or a tariff on Switzerland, or in the other case he used as an example on India, was a way of putting pressure indirectly on Putin with respect to the Ukraine. The basic idea was we use tariffs as threats, not always to raise revenue. The idea was you can threaten to impose a tariff and never actually impose it. That idea seemed to appeal a lot to Justice Alito, but they were grasping at straws. The question wasn't, could the threat of tariffs ever be used? It was, could the entire tariff system be rewritten unilaterally under a statute that, as Justice Barrett pointed out, had never once in its been used in this way? And it's true that there's always a first time, but here there's a reason why it hadn't been used. The reason it hadn't been used, even though it would have been in many ways a lot easier than all these specialized laws, is that everybody realized that that's not what Congress was doing. It was not giving the president the power to rewrite the tariff laws of the country. It was simply giving him the power to control importation, or as a matter of fact, exportation. The Supreme Court heard oral arguments on November 5th, 2025, in a case challenging the use of emergency powers to impose broad tariffs on imports from over 100 countries. This stems from an invocation of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to enact these measures. Bypassing Congress, the tariffs aimed at addressing trade imbalances and national security concerns.
National security concerns, that's their go-to excuse.
Drawn lawsuits from affected industries and trade groups arguing executive overreach. From the arguments, a majority of justices, including conservatives like Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Kavanaugh, expressed skepticism about the administration's broad interpretation of emergency powers. They questioned whether ongoing trade issues qualify as true emergencies warranting unilateral action, with Justice Sotomayor noting potential economic harm to consumers and businesses. Even recent appointees like Justice Barrett seemed dubious probing the lack of congressional involvement. This cross-ideological doubt suggests the court may rule against the tariffs or limit future executive use of the act, reinforcing separation of powers. Economically, these tariffs have already raised costs for U.S. manufacturers reliant on imports, contributing to inflation and supply chain disruptions. Proponents argue they protect domestic jobs in steel and tech sectors, but critics highlight retaliatory measures from allies like the EU and Canada, which could escalate into trade wars. Politically, a ruling against this would be a setback for the America First agenda, especially post-2024 election, where tariffs were a campaign cornerstone. It might force a need for legislative approval, testing GOP control in Congress. On the left, this could be seen as a check on authoritarian tendencies, emphasizing democratic processes over executive fiat. Progressives have long criticized tariffs for disproportionately burdening low-income households via higher prices on goods like electronics and apparel. However, some union-aligned Democrats support targeted protections for workers. From the right, defenders frame it as necessary for countering China's unfair practices, with the administration arguing flexibility is key for national security.
I stopped at the 10-minute and 44-second mark. You can watch the rest of it. Bottom line is that, as stupid as Trump is, he doesn't recognize that his tariff grift is going down the drain, and SCOTUS is going to rule against him. He is, and he will be, a lame duck. I can't do this alone, folks. Pass it along, and thanks for listening.